Welcome to Chief Chat. I'm your host, Paula Hersey. With me today, Chief Sonneman. And there's a new law on the books dealing with vulnerable road users law and crash reporting. I mean, it's the longest name for a law, but basically it means let's give some bikes and pedestrians some space on the roads.
Breathing room.
Some breathing room. Let's talk about this law.
Seems like I was just here, Paula.
It does, doesn't it?
Time flies.
Time flies,
Nice,
right?
doesn't it?
What is the Massachusetts Vulnerable Road Users Law?
In a nutshell,
In a nutshell.
if someone's not in a car, if they're a pedestrian on a bike, riding a horse, whatever it might be, and they're in the roadway, they are vulnerable to being hit by a vehicle. They are not protected by a big suit of armor that surrounds you when you're driving in your car or in your truck, and you have to give them some space.
Okay.
And the law in the state used to be that if there was a pedestrian or a bike or a horse or whatever in the lane of travel, you had to give them a reasonable amount of distance and you had to slow to a reasonable speed to go around them. The problem being with that is everyone's definition of reasonable is a little bit malleable.
Right, and we know that specifically from South Street and trying to cross the street.
Exactly.
The reasonable speed on South Street
It's about 80?
is about 80, right? But there's some provisions in here that folks really need to be aware of. One, increased penalties for drivers who injure or kill.
That is correct.
Mandatory completion of traffic safety program for violators, and enhanced driver education on sharing the road. Encouragement of law enforcement agencies to collect data on crashes involving vulnerable road users. That's new, sort of.
Yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, the big thing that everyone really needs to understand, how does this impact me as a driver?
Right.
You have to give 4 feet of space
Okay.
to whoever you're passing on the side of the road. So if they're on a bike, if they're walking, if they're whatever it is, you slow down and you give them enough space, and the law now defines that as 4 feet. It doesn't leave it as reasonable distance anymore. It's 4 feet. And you are allowed to pass over a double yellow line. So if the 4 feet would carry over a double yellow line, you have to go over a double yellow line to pass somebody, you're now allowed to do that. So if I was driving behind you in my police car and you went over the double yellow line because you're going around Johnny Jones who's walking on the side of the street, I can't pull you over for going over the double yellow line. You're given that pass in that circumstance to go over the double yellow line, provided you're doing so safely. It's like, don't do it around a corner. You got to be able to see clearly that you're not going to run head on into the Mack truck that's coming.
Right.
But you get 4 feet. So that it really helps people to decide, because let's face it, you're driving down the street and you're like, well, am I far enough away from the bike? Am I too far? And everyone tries to stay in that lane because they don't want to get over, and you end up being too close. So it's 4 feet. You give people 4 feet. Now, the data collection portion you're talking about is, we all do, clearly motor vehicle accident reports in the police department. Well, the state has automated a lot of that now. So we enter that data in. We have electronic forms that we enter in, and they go directly to the registry. But they've added fields and they've added data collection points specifically related to pedestrian accidents, bicycle accidents, and other vulnerable users that are involved in accidents. So you collect that data through the crash form. It's reported back to the state. They've also, like you said, they've added penalties, increased the fines and things like that. If you get into an accident and you hurt someone that was a vulnerable road user, then you could go to, you could face an enhanced penalty, you could face jail time, you could get, you might have to go to a traffic school and complete that. You could get your license suspended or revoked or whatnot. There's a lot of these things were in place before, but they were kind of haphazard. They weren't all brought together under one umbrella. So the vulnerable road user law brings a lot of these things under one umbrella and makes it a little bit easier for the state in particular to keep an eye on violators of that law.
All right. You talked about some of the folks that might be affected by this, obviously bicyclists and pedestrians and horses. What about these e-bikes and the e-scooters? Like, we see these all the time now.
Oh, yeah.
They're motorized, but are they included in this?
Sort of. Some of them have gas engines, and some of them have, some of them have those electric engines. But yeah, if you're not in a car, basically you should be thinking that that's a vulnerable road
Okay.
user because they can be hit and they can be hurt very easily. So they're not a motor vehicle. They don't fall into a motor vehicle portion of it. Now, would it apply to motorcycles? No, it doesn't particularly apply to motorcycles. They're dealing with people that are on, like I said, bicycles, pedestrians, horses, things like that. So I would imagine, that those people on skateboards and things like that, they do fall under that because they tend to look at them more as pedestrians, particularly when they're using those modes of transportation, than they do that they're not in a motor vehicle.
Before we wrap this up, because this is a big law, this is something that folks really need to be aware of. It came in...
Particularly people who drive on the sidewalk.
Is particularly for people who
Yes,
drive
they do
outside. But it came out in March, and I think it fell under the radar of a lot of folks, and that they're not
March 1st,
really
yep.
understanding of what this law is. But let's remind people of some of the things that we've had this discussion before, because it's one of my pet peeves is, how do we stop at a crosswalk? Can we stop at a crosswalk? Can the bike be in the middle of the road, or can they be off the shoulder of the road? What are some of those top 5 tips you want to give motorists and the people who are on a bike or crossing the street? What are your top 5 tips?
Okay,
for
so
those
for all that, when I said that bikes aren't motor vehicles, the state looks at them as vehicles.
as vehicles?
Okay, not motor vehicles, but they look at them as vehicles. They're expected to obey the rules of the road as well. Stop at stop signs, stop at traffic lights, all that other stuff, right? They are allowed, because they're considered to be a vehicle, they are allowed to be in the middle of the lane.
Okay.
So if you're driving down, say, South Street, right, and they can be in the middle of that lane. They do not have to move over as far to the right as possible. A lot of them do that out of the interest of self-preservation.
Sure.
So they move to the side of the road and try and stay out of the way of the vehicle, because a 6,000-pound vehicle wins.
Sure.
But they are allowed to ride their bike in the middle of the lane, and you are expected to pass them like you would any other vehicle that's out there. They are allowed to ride 2 abreast. Okay, so these groups that are out there riding 3 abreast, they're not allowed to do that. They can ride double stack down the center of the road if they want to.
Okay.
In their lane.
Right.
Not like literally in the middle of the road, but in their lane. They're allowed to do that. They do not have to move completely over to the right or ride single file, but a lot of them do that out of courtity. And we were going to ask me, I talked too much.
The whole crosswalk thing.
Crosswalk. So bikes, crosswalks. Bikes are not pedestrians. So if they're at a crosswalk, they are supposed to get off their bike and walk across the crosswalk, because the crosswalks are for pedestrians, not bicyclists.
Okay.
All right, crosswalks. If somebody is in a crosswalk, you have to stop your car. Now, that's easy for people to understand on a street that's a 2-way street, single lane, 2-way. See a pedestrian, both sides stop generally, right? Generally. And the pedestrian walks across fine. Problem we run into a problem is some of these streets, particularly like Main Street, South Street, and some of these other roads that are 2-lane, 1-way, is a driver will stop in one lane, but then the one in the outside lane won't stop, and that's a problem. But the law says that if someone stops for a crosswalk, you have to stop as well. You can't pass someone that stopped for a crosswalk, because you can't see the pedestrian that's walking around or across the other side. Right. So you still have to stop. And pedestrians, it really comes down to, are they waiting to go in the crosswalk or not? So pedestrians, if you're out there, don't just hang around at the top of a crosswalk, just sitting there reading your book or whatever, because then people stop and they wait and you don't go. If you're there, you're supposed to stop.
Right. And the last one, it's also Motorcycle Awareness Month.
Is it too?
It is.
Oh,
May has always been, and I know we have.
Look twice, save a life, right?
Look twice,
save a life.
Save a life.
Yes.
Our police department's out there on their bikes already, and
Absolutely.
Seen them out there on the mills,
They
taking a long ride.
I'm looking for you.
Yeah, I wasn't on the sidewalk. Well, these are really great tips. Again, this is the Vulnerable Users of Road.
Vulnerable Road Users Law.
So many words.
Yes.
You really want to pay attention to this, folks. 4 feet to anybody who's not in a vehicle, pretty much.
Pretty much.
All right. Excellent. Thanks, Chief.
Have a great day.
Thank you.